All right, buckle up for this one. We got a deep dive into some pretty wild events coming out of South Korea.
Yeah, you heard that right.
South Korea. Yesterday, December 3rd, 2024, President Yoon Suk Yeol, well, he went and declared martial law. And we've got a whole stack of reports and analysis to try and make sense of it all.
It's pretty crazy, right? Like, think about it, South Korea, this modern democracy, and suddenly, boom, military control. What's really hitting me is, what does this actually mean for people there? You know, everyday South Koreans, imagine just like waking up to that news, your whole life's been pretty stable, you think you've got these freedoms, and then bam, it's all different.
Yeah, it's tough to wrap your head around, that's for sure. I mean, it feels like something out of like a movie or something.
Yeah.
Not something that actually happens in a place like South Korea.
Yeah.
So bring it down for us. How did this even get started?
Well, so it all goes back to their constitution, Article 77 to be exact. It lays out the rules for martial law, like when can it be declared and all that. And get this, it says it's allowed during wartime. Okay, that makes sense. Or warlike situations. I guess that's a bit fuzzier. But then it also says, or other comparable national emergency states.
Okay, so that last part, comparable national emergency, that seems like it could be open to interpretation. But I mean, look, political disagreements happen all the time, right? Even in really strong democracies, there's going to be tension. So what exactly did President Yoon say was so bad that it justified this national emergency?
Right. Well, that's where things get a bit complicated. See, Yoon's whole argument hinges on what the opposition party's been doing. They're the liberals, and they've got the majority in parliament. And they've been butting heads with Yoon's conservative party big time.
So classic political gridlock. That's not that unusual.
Yeah, but it's gone beyond just, like, disagreeing on policy. I mean, they've been blocking Yoon's budget proposals left and right. And hold on, get this. They even tried to impeach some of his prosecutors.
Wait, hold up. Impeach prosecutors. That doesn't sound like your run-of-the-mill political spat.
Yeah, so in South Korea, prosecutors have a lot of power. It's a big deal.
Oh, interesting.
And who gets those jobs, those appointments, that's been a huge point of conflict between Yoon and the opposition. So when they tried to impeach these guys, Yoon saw it as a direct attack.
Like they were trying to undermine him on purpose.
Exactly. He basically said they were trying to paralyze the whole government on purpose.
Wow. So he's using internal disagreements, politics as usual, to justify, what, basically a power grab?
Pretty much, yeah. He even started throwing around these accusations that the opposition is anti-state.
Oh, wow.
Like they're the enemy or something. And even worse, he's saying they're echoing North Korean talking points, trying to paint them as, like, sympathetic to North Korea.
So he's framing this whole thing as a national security threat.
Exactly. But a lot of people aren't buying it, They see right through it.
Yeah.
Especially given how unpopular Yoon's become. He's had a lot of controversies, and his whole leadership style is very, shall we say, forceful.
Right, so people are seeing this as him just trying to hold on to power.
Pretty much.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty then. Martial law is declared. What happens next? What's it like on the ground for people in South Korea?
Picture this. The parliament building, completely surrounded by troops, helicopters landing right there on the lawn, and this feeling in the air, like a wave of fear washing over the city.
Wow, that's intense.
People started gathering, protesting. Some even got into scuffles with the soldiers.
Yeah, there was this one report that really stuck with me. It said this woman, she literally tried to pull a rifle away from a soldier. And she's shouting at him, "Aren't you embarrassed?" Like, you can just feel the raw emotion in that moment.
Oh, absolutely.
But beyond that initial shock, beyond those images, what were the real-world consequences for regular people?
Well, right away, a bunch of restrictions slammed into place. Political activities banned, limits on the press, on people gathering, just gone. They could arrest people without warrants.
Whoa.
Even doctors who were on strike, they were ordered back to work.
Wow, so this wasn't just some political game. It had real impact.
Absolutely. It directly affected people's everyday lives.
I mean, think about it. Not knowing if you can speak your mind, if you can meet up with your friends, if you can even get reliable news.
Yeah, and we've got the CNN article here. It talks about people rushing to be with their families. They were terrified of what might happen next, especially for those who remember the old days, when South Korea was under authoritarian rule. This must have brought back some really bad memories.
So it's not just about the rules themselves, it's about the feeling it creates.
Exactly. That fear, that uncertainty, it seeps into everything.
It makes it hard to feel safe, even in your own home.
And that psychological impact, that can be just as damaging as any law.
Yeah, erodes trust, creates these divisions.
Makes it hard for people to feel like they belong, like their country's for them.
But the story doesn't end there, thankfully. The South Korean parliament, they were literally surrounded by troops,
Hmm.
but they took some pretty bold action.
Yeah, they didn't mess around. They immediately said, Yoon's martial law decree, it's invalid, doesn't count.
Wow.
And then they held a vote to overturn it,
Yeah.
and the majority voted against Yoon's. Speaker Woo Won-shik, he made this powerful speech talking about how they have to protect democracy, and he praised the military for respecting the outcome of the vote, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's like, on the one hand, they stood up to this power grab, but on the other hand, the fact that it even happened is pretty terrifying.
It really makes you think about how fragile these systems are, even in a country with a relatively recent history of democracy. This isn't ancient history. This is happening right now. It's impacting millions of people's lives.
And that brings us back to the everyday South Korean. Martial law is lifted, but what happens to them now?
Well, things are going to be pretty chaotic for a while. There'll be investigations, maybe even impeachment proceedings against Yoon. A lot of political shuffling, people trying to figure out what happens next.
But thinking long term, what does this mean for the average person just trying to live their life?
Well, the biggest worry is that this whole thing just makes the political divide even worse. Yoon's Conservative Party against the liberal opposition. It'll be even harder for them to work together on, the stuff that matters to people, the economy, social programs, education, all that.
So instead of focusing on the needs of the people, they'll just be fighting for power.
Exactly. And that can have real consequences. Like, imagine the government is so busy infighting that they can't pass important economic reforms, or they can't respond effectively to a health crisis or something.
And what about people's trust in the government? That's going to be shattered after something like this.
It's hard to see how it wouldn't be. Imagine this. You go to bed in a democracy, you wake up, and suddenly you're being told you don't have the same freedoms anymore. That kind of experience, it can really shake your faith in the whole system.
Yeah, it's like a violation of that basic agreement between the government and the people.
Exactly. And rebuilding that trust, it's incredibly difficult.
People might become less likely to vote, less likely to speak up, even just less likely to care.
And that creates this dangerous cycle. The government acts badly, people lose trust, and that makes it easier for the government to do even worse things.
It's a slippery slope towards authoritarianism.
And we can't forget about the possibility of copycats. If Yoon had gotten away with this, who knows what other politicians might try. It could have set a really dangerous precedent.
Like a signal to anyone who wants to grab power that it's possible to get away with it.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the bigger picture. If this can happen in South Korea, it can happen anywhere, right?
That's the scary truth. Even the most stable democracies are vulnerable.
It's a wake-up call for all of us.
And while all the political stuff is important, we can't lose sight of the human cost. How is this affecting ordinary South Koreans? We've talked about the fear and uncertainty, but what about the deeper psychological impact?
Yeah, imagine living through that.
It can be incredibly traumatizing. That feeling of helplessness, that loss of control, especially for those who lived through South Korea's authoritarian past. For them, this isn't just politics, it's a nightmare come back to life.
It's like they thought they'd escaped that, and now it's back to haunt them.
And even for younger generations, this could be a defining moment. It can make them cynical, distrustful, afraid of the future.
So the true cost of this, we might not even know for years.
That's a real possibility.
And it highlights how important it is to protect those democratic norms, to hold leaders accountable.
Because once those norms are eroded, getting them back is a long and difficult process.
This all sounds pretty bleak.
It's definitely a serious situation.
But is there any reason for hope? Any light at the end of the tunnel?
I'm glad you asked that. Because there are some glimmers of hope. And they lie in the resilience of the South Korean people.
So what do you mean?
Well, despite everything, despite the fear and the shock, we've seen incredible courage from ordinary people. That woman trying to take the rifle from the soldier, the thousands who protested, they refused to just accept this power grab.
And the parliament, too.
Right. They didn't back down, even with the military right there. They defended their constitution.
That's powerful.
It shows that even in the darkest moments, democracy can still function, and the people can still make their voices heard.
That's a hopeful sign, not just for South Korea, but for democracies everywhere.
It really is.
So even with all the risk, there's still a chance that South Korea can come out of this stronger.
Absolutely. The next few months will be crucial. How they handle the political fallout, how they address the underlying issues, how they rebuild trust, that will determine the future of their democracy.
Okay, so we've got this internal struggle playing out. But what about the rest of the world? How are other countries reacting to all this?
Well, the U.S., South Korea's biggest ally, they're pretty worried. They've said they're seriously concerned, especially because they weren't given any heads up about the martial law thing.
Yeah, that's got to sting.
And it's not just about hurt feelings. This could really destabilize things between the U.S. and South Korea. Their relationship is already kind of strained. There's disagreements on how to deal with North Korea.
Right, so this adds another layer of complexity.
It's a big mess.
So it's not just a domestic crisis, it's an international one too.
Exactly.
And it could have ripple effects far beyond South Korea.
That's the thing about our world. Everything's connected. What happens in one place can have huge consequences for everyone else, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as democracy.
So where do we go from here? What are the different ways this could play out in South Korea, and what would that mean for people on the ground?
Well, those are some really big questions. And to get into that, we'll have to dive into some potential scenarios.
Okay, well, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll explore those scenarios and what they could mean for the future of South Korea. And maybe, just maybe, for the future of democracy itself.
Sounds good to me. Okay, so where were we? Right, South Korea, democracy on the edge.
Yeah, it's a lot to process. Martial law, lifted, but the aftershocks, they're definitely still being felt.
For sure. The question is, what happens now? I mean, we could see this whole thing as a wake-up call, right? Like a chance for South Korea to take a good, hard look at itself.
Like a national reset button.
Kind of, yeah. They could use this to strengthen their democracy, figure out how to prevent something like this from ever happening again, rebuild trust in the government, all that.
That'd be the best case scenario, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. But it's going to take some serious work. Everyone's got to be willing to talk, to compromise, put the good of the country ahead of their own political agendas.
Easier said than done, maybe.
Yeah, it's a big ask.
But what if it goes the other way? What if things get even worse?
That's the scary part. If this just makes the political divide even deeper, it could lead to more instability, maybe even violence.
Oh, man.
And that would just make everything worse. People would lose even more trust in the government. And that's exactly the kind of environment where authoritarianism can thrive.
So it's like a vicious cycle.
Exactly. And imagine what that would be like for everyday people. Constant fear, suspicion, not knowing who to trust.
Like living in a pressure cooker.
Exactly. And the impact on their lives, it'd be huge. The economy could tank, social unrest could boil over, nobody would feel safe.
So it's not just a political crisis, it's a human crisis.
Right, and that's why the whole world's watching this so closely. It's a test case, almost. Can a democracy survive this kind of shock? Can they come back from the brink?
So what can the rest of us do?
Yeah.
I mean, it's easy to feel helpless watching all this unfold.
I get that. But here's the thing. The fight for democracy, it's not just happening in South Korea. It's happening everywhere. And we all have a role to play.
Okay, but what can we actually do?
Well, first, stay informed. Know what's going on not just in your own country, but around the world. Support organizations that are fighting for democracy and human rights. Even just talking to your friends and family about these issues, that matters.
So even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely. Every voice counts.
Well, we started this deep dive with a pretty shocking headline. A president declaring martial law in a modern democracy.
Yeah, it's not something you see every day.
We've talked about the complexities, the risks, the potential consequences, but we've also seen some glimmers of hope.
That resilience of the people, that's got to count for something.
Here's the thing that's really sticking with me. If this can happen in South Korea, where does that leave the rest of us? Is democracy more fragile than we think? And if so, what are we willing to do to protect it?
Those are the questions we all need to be asking ourselves right now.
Because the answers, they might surprise us. Okay, so we've been talking about this crisis in South Korea, this martial law situation, and it's left us with a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty. But one thing's for sure, South Korea is at a crossroads right now. The choices they make in the coming weeks and months, they're going to have huge consequences, not just for their own country, but for the whole idea of democracy.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. This whole thing started with one man, President Yoon. He decided to use this emergency power, this martial law, and it threw the whole country into chaos.
But it made people question, can democracy really protect itself? Or is it more fragile than we think?
Right, and that's the big question hanging over everything. What happens now? What does the future hold for South Korea?
So let's get into that. What are some of the possible scenarios that could play out?
Well, the best case, and let's be honest, it's a long shot, is that this whole thing serves as a wake-up call. like a shock to the system that forces everyone to step back and say, okay, we need to fix this.
So like a chance for real reform.
Exactly. They could strengthen their democratic institutions, figure out ways to prevent this from happening again, rebuild trust between the government and the people.
But that requires everyone to be on the same page, right?
Yeah, it's a tall order. You need the politicians to put aside their differences, to actually work together for the common good, and you need the people to be engaged, to hold their leaders accountable.
So not impossible, but definitely a challenge.
A big one.
But what if it doesn't go that way? What if things get even worse?
That's the other side of the coin, and it's a scary thought. If this crisis just deepens the divisions in South Korean society, it could lead to more instability, maybe even violence.
And that would just make everything worse, right?
Absolutely. More fear, more distress, less faith in the government. It would be a breeding ground for authoritarianism.
So in that scenario, what happens to the average person in South Korea?
They're the ones who suffer the most. Their lives become unpredictable, their freedoms get restricted, they might lose their jobs, their homes, even their loved ones.
It's like their whole world gets turned upside down.
Exactly. And the psychological impact, that can be devastating. Living in a constant state of fear and anxiety, not knowing what tomorrow will bring.
And that's why this whole situation is so important. It's not just about South Korea, it's about the future of democracy itself.
Right. If a country like South Korea, with its strong democratic traditions, can fall into this trap, it's a warning sign for all of us.
So what can we do? How can we protect democracy, both in our own countries and around the world?
Well, the first step is to be aware, to be informed. Know what's going on, not just in your own backyard, but globally.
Don't bury your head in the sand.
Exactly. And then get involved. Support organizations that are working to promote democracy and human rights. Talk to your friends and family about these issues, raise awareness. Even small actions can make a difference.
So it's not about being a superhero. It's about doing what you can where you are.
Exactly, because every voice matters.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've seen the fragility of democracy, the dangers of authoritarianism, but we've also seen the courage of ordinary people, their determination to fight for their freedoms.
And that's what gives me hope.
Me too. So as we wrap things up, I want to leave you with this. The future of democracy, it's not something that's just handed down to us. It's something we have to fight for every single day. And that fight, it starts with each and every one of us. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.